And also I wanted to say thank you to so many of you that wore your Christmas sweaters. I put that on our agenda today, wear Christmas sweaters, and quite a few of you did it. So when I've done other themes, it hasn't gone over as well as tonight's theme with Christmas sweaters. So I appreciate lots of red here tonight. All right, with that, here is Ed Kazmarek, who is now going to introduce our speaker tonight. Here's Ed.
Well, since this is my last time doing this, yeah, okay, you don't have to cheer that I'm leaving. I do have a few things I want to touch on. First, Polly and I do thank all of you for the opportunity to do the role we've been doing now for 6 years. We'll be back. You don't get rid of us that easy, but we won't be in that position. Maggie will be taking care of it. I do want to mention that I think the organization benefits from a really good board, and especially I want to thank Dick for the opportunities and the hard work that he's done to get us through COVID and keep everything moving, and the club is moving forward. The board members are very diligent. You might want to consider doing some of that in the future. I would also say that there are some positions that aren't official, that don't need to be voted on, but they are very helpful in the organization, and they could be a good opportunity for you to try it out a little bit without making too big of a commitment right up front. So think about how you might be able to contribute to the organization. I see there was a lot of attention to the books today, and I'll just comment that I've seen more people bringing a variety of books in, and so I thank all of you for contributing, and I would encourage you to check out what's there, because it is a quite varied assortment of books, more than we might have had at times in the past. And so with that, we'll move on to our speaker tonight. And Robert Heacock is a Westerners board member and club historian, native of Kennewick, and lives in Liberty Lake. Serves in different committees of the Pacific Northwest region of Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, a frequent contributor to their newsletter. He's also a historian on the Snake and Columbia River cruise boats. And tonight, he's going to talk about early missionaries to the Pacific Northwest. And with that, I will say adios and pass this over.
Well, thanks very much, Ed. We really appreciate everything you and Polly have done. You guys have been great. So good evening, everybody. So we got kind of an interesting topic that we haven't really talked about in the past. I don't think a whole lot, but the more I started digging into this, I said, gee, this is a great topic, because so much of what we're happening here is tied into the fur trade, okay? You know, Jacques Cartier first came over from France, and he was hunting for a water route to China. You know, is there a water route from Europe to China and Asia? And so he, you know, stopped in, but he founded Quebec and Montreal and everything. Then, of course, Spanish are coming up, you know, Santa Fe and everything. This is what North America looked like 1650. But look at the detail on the East Coast and the Caribbean. And look at, you know, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. Okay? Last unexplored coastline on the planet. And then you really see that from the ocean side, you know, there are sea explorers and everything. And you see it from the land side here, too. This map never changed till Captain Cook showed up in 1778. So Marquette and Joliet, they go down to Mississippi. They went all the way down to the Arkansas River, which is almost, they didn't want to go all the way down to Mississippi and get run into the Spanish. So they turned around in the Arkansas River. St. Louis was founded, and then Father Sarah was in California. Now, Spanish were busy in California 65 years, almost 70 years before anything happened up here. Okay, I mean, 65 years, that's a long time. That's a big gap. So they finally showed up. And of course, here's our buddies, you know, Lewis and Clark, they cruised through the area and everything, you know, just to show that it could be done, right? And John Jacob Astor, We talked last week about, or last month, about Randall McDonald, who was born at Fort Astoria. Why is this important to our story? Because his employees settled in Oregon. A lot of them settled down in what's called the French Prairie, south of Portland, between Portland and Salem, Oregon. And so they're the ones, you know, of course they're French Canadians, so they're the ones that did a lot of that. And of course 1825, at Fort Astoria, then Fort George, that kind of got left to the wayside, and Hudson Bay Company started Fort Vancouver, 1825. And so that's very, very important too. You know, if you've ever been to Fort Vancouver, I mean, it's interesting, but then you realize how important it was. There was Montreal, and there was Fort Vancouver, and all these places in between. But Fort Vancouver was a really important piece of everything. So a lot of the Iroquois, they got involved in the fur trade. They went to Montreal, where, you know, grew up in the French culture and everything. And their leader was, you know, Old Ignace, and that's pretty important to us too. So what they did, they were back in Montreal. They came out to Montana, the Flathead Valley, for the fur trade. Flathead Valley, primarily north of Missoula, Montana, up to Kalispell, but then also down the Bitterroot Valley, south down there. And so they kind of got adopted into the Flatheads. And the Iroquois were given them a lot of instruction and everything. So some of the Flatheads went to St. Louis. They wanted the white man's book. And so 2 of them died in St. Louis. The 4 of them made it. 3 of them turned back. 4 of them made it. 2 of them died in St. Louis. They died at the home of the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, who was red-haired chief, okay? William Clark. They died at the home of William Clark, because where he had his home right near the arch, he had his Indian agency right next door. And so they died there. 2 of them, they got their instruction and everything in St. Louis, and then they went back on the Flathead Valley. They got on a steamboat, and they're in the same steamboat as George Catlin. George Catlin was a very famous Western artist, and he painted these 2 pictures of him. Very, very famous paintings of Native Americans. No horns on his head. However, 2 of them died in St. Louis. These 2 both died before they got back home. No horns on his head, died at the mouth of the Yellowstone River near Montana, North Dakota border. Rabbit skin leggings, he made it a little bit farther. He ran into a band of Flatheads who were hunting bison on the Missouri River. But they were in Blackfeet country, and they got attacked by the Blackfeet, and he was killed. So 4 of them made it to St. Louis. Unfortunately, none of them made it back to the Flathead Valley. But that story really sparked quite an interest, and it got published in a newspaper. So this is what really jump-started all the missionaries coming out here. You know, we got to come out here and save the natives. So the old cathedral in St. Louis. You guys, how many have been to St. Louis and have been here? Seen this? Okay, this is actually what was here. 1834 building. That was the 4th church at this location. But this is this is the same church, not the same building. It was a few years before. This is where William Clark had Sacagawea's 2 children baptized. In the building number 3, right before this one. But everybody used this church and the ones before it because there's a lot of Hebrew inscriptions on the front of this church on the outside. So, you know, Protestants use it, the Jewish people use it, Catholics use it, the Jesuits use it, everybody uses it. But 1834, that's really when our story really starts. And so this is the building that witnessed most of what we're going to be talking about. So, Old Ignace, he says, okay, well, we didn't hear anything from the 4 guys we sent to St. Louis. Let's try again. So he and his 2 sons went to St. Louis, and they were successful. They got their instruction and everything, and then they returned to the Flathead Valley. So that trip was a pretty good success for them. They said, well, let's try it again. That worked okay. So a couple years later, they start again, and they get attacked by the Sioux in Ash Hollow, Nebraska, and they're killed there in Ash Hollow. So kind of a big loss there at that point. Here's his son. His son was with him on the first trip, whereas his 2 sons actually. This is one of his sons. Younging base. And Younging base was pretty important for a lot of the people that came afterwards. And of course, he spoke French, he spoke, you know, the Flathead and everything else. So the Pacific Fur Company workers down at Fort Vancouver and the French Prairie, south of Portland, they hadn't had any religious instruction or seen a priest for 15 to 20 years. So they start writing letters. They said, well, we want to have something out here. We want priests out here. And so they got a response. The response is, we're working on it. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough money. But we'll see what we can do. And so eventually that did come together. So Hudson Bay Company, they had an internal committee that said, you know, we need to start doing more for our employees, because you got these employees, they're different backgrounds and everything. So they said, we're going to try to accommodate some of these missionaries who are coming. So Governor George Simpson, from Hudson Bay House in London, said, you have these guys in Montreal, we'll take them to Fort Vancouver. Okay? Now Lachine, which is the original part of Montreal, downtown Montreal, the French spelling for China is C-H-I-N-E, Chine. So Lachine, you know, Jacques Cartier gave it that name. He said, okay, we can't get through here to China, but we're going to call it China and kind of stop right here and do our local exploration. But obviously we won't be able to go through straight to China. But that's why downtown, the old original downtown part of Montreal is Lachine. And that's what it was known as. And he was writing from Hudson Bay House. Hudson Bay House, #1 Line Street in London. That's at the location there is now Lloyd's of London. Okay, so that it was Hudson Bay House, then it was the East India, it was the Tea House, East India Company, and now it's Lloyd's of London. So they found, so the bishop found a couple guys, Father Blanchette and Father Demers, and said, you're going to be going to Fort Vancouver, start packing, you're going to Fort Vancouver, okay? And so gave him some instructions before he left. And of course they were primarily looking at the Native Americans. Because there was very few whites out here. I mean, you know, obviously there was a much greater population of Native Americans out here than there were whites at that time, Europeans out here. So, you know, that's their first goal, take care of the Native Americans out here. And so, you know, 6 months, almost 7 months to get from Montreal to Fort Vancouver. Went up to Ottawa, went up the Ottawa River to Lake Nipissing, went down the French River to the Lake Huron, went to Lake Superior, and then, like I say, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Athabasca Pass. I know when we had Jack Nisbet here, he was talking about David Thompson and Athabasca Pass and everything. Pretty important spot, really. And then coming down, you grew up in the Pacific Northwest, you kind of take a lot of this for granted. But you see how important Columbia River was. Now, on the U.S. side, this was known as the Oregon Territory, the Oregon Country. But if you were one of the Canadians, it was the Columbia District. So it had different names depending on what direction you're coming from. 5,300 miles, okay? And here's Fort Vancouver. The original church was inside the fort, and you can see Mount Hood in the background there. And then eventually they built a church farther out. And then they moved on the other side of the freeway a little bit later. So the first mission, when they said, okay, where do you want us to go? Where should we build our missions now that we made it here? The first place they wanted was to go to Cowlitz. Cowlitz is north of Longview, but it's on the route between the Columbia River, Fort Vancouver, and Puget Sound. And so that's why they said you need to build your mission at that spot. So they did that. Now see the little brown pole on the right? That's a replica of the Catholic ladder. Now, a lot of the black robes that came out here, most of them were European. They spoke European languages. They spoke Latin for their liturgy. They spoke Native American languages, and they conducted business in English. But they worked with the natives in Chinook jargon. Chinook jargon is kind of a mix of, you know, French and Spanish and native and English and everything. And it had pretty limited vocabulary. Where are the elk, how much for a fur, things like that. Pretty limited vocabulary, difficult to talk about, you know, theology and everything with them. And so Father Blanchett came up with the Catholic ladder, more of a visual representation. And in the middle is the later part of it. But here's what it looks like. You know, it's kind of laying down because it's so tall. But you can see all the big heavy marks on the left-hand side. Each one of those big heavy marks is 100 years of Old Testament time. And it goes, you know, the Tower of Babel and the Great Flood and all those things. So he's trying to demonstrate, you know, 4,000 years of Old Testament history. And then you have 33 smaller marks, which is, you know, where Jesus was here. And then you have the 12 apostles, and then you have the crucifixion. So this is what the stories that they're trying to convey, and this is the best way to do it. And then after the crucifixion, then you've got 18 big marks for 18 centuries, 1800 years, and then smaller marks which represent Blanchett and Damaris. And so, you know, but they're trying to use all these visual things to get the message to the natives. It became very, very popular. In fact, we'll talk a little bit later about Eliza Spalding. This is her version of it. You know, it's laying on its side, unfortunately, too. A little bit different artwork on it and everything, but this is kind of her version because they didn't like the other version. So St. Paul, Oregon, that was their number 3 spot. They had their first mission at Fort Vancouver, second mission at Cowlitz, and then they went down to St. Paul, Oregon, which is again south of Portland. And the small replica church there, remember these guys were writing letters 1834, 1832, even before before Blanchett showed up, they built the church for Father Blanchett. Said, we want priests, we even built your church. And right in front there is a replica of the church that sat there, you know, sat there for 2 years before anybody actually showed up. And then the brick church, the modern church, is in the background. That was actually built in 1836. So this saw, or excuse me, 1846. So this saw a lot of what we're going to be talking about here too, that building. So here's Father Blanchett. You know, this is not an easy thing to do, folks, traveling for 6 months. They were coming down Athabasca Pass on this side, on the Columbia River, and they had it was quite a big group of canoes and everything, and quite a mix of passengers. A lot of the Hudson Bay people, but then, you know, botanists and different people coming out here. And one guy took it upon himself, with their nearest set of rapids and everything, took it upon himself to stand up and take his coat off, dump the canoe, and 12 people drowned. Okay. And Father DeSmet, when he was coming down the Columbia later, their canoe got caught in a whirlpool, and, you know, 5 or 6 people drowned. I mean, it was very, very dangerous. And so Blanchett really wanted to make sure that they knew this is not a walk in the park, just getting out here. Okay? And if we've got to travel in this area, it's going to be difficult travel. So here comes Father DeSmet, originally from Belgium, first missionary on the Rocky Mountains. Now, when we say that, we mean the U.S. Rocky Mountains. You know, of course, Blanchett was up in the Canadian Rockies, but Father DeSmet was the first one down here. But he made 19 trips to Europe. He wrote 4 books, and then he would always go back and do fundraising. Some of his co-workers got a little irritated with him because he wouldn't stay in one spot long enough to do anything. He was kind of the marketing guy. He would go meet all the tribes, and everybody knew who he was. And then he'd say, the church will do this for you, the government's going to do this for you, and then he takes off. You know, but he still covered a lot of ground, and he was really able to use that to a lot of benefits later. But 8 trips to Europe, and so you know, he never didn't sit still very long. So Father DeSmet, he didn't even get ordained in Europe. He got ordained in St. Louis. So, you know, he came out even before he was a priest. But really wanted to be a missionary in the Rocky Mountains. As far as he could get was St. Joseph's Mission at Council Bluffs on the Missouri River, Council Bluffs, Omaha. There wasn't anything farther out past that. He's saying, gee, I really want to get to the Rocky Mountains. So as he's there at Council Bluffs, who comes down the river but two more flatheads? And they say, boy, are we glad to see you. And he says, boy, am I glad to see you guys, okay? So he writes some letters of introduction so they can get to St. Louis. And then he realizes, this is what I've been waiting for. He didn't want to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. So he said, you know, I got a sore back. I think I need to go back to St. Louis for medical treatment and accompany them. So he did that. Went back there with him and, you know, convinced the bishop, okay, let's start moving out that way and everything. And so he did come back out the following spring. And young Ignace stayed to guide him. The other flathead who was with young Ignace made an epic trip to get back to the Bitterroot Valley, 8 Mile Creek of Bitterroot Valley near Stevensville, and said the black robes were coming. Arrived in like January, February. So very difficult. So he leaves St. Louis, and again, the Fur Brigade. Okay, we got the Hudson Bay Company, and then you got the Scottish. The Scots had the Northwest Company, and then John Jacob Astor had the American Fur Company. And so the American Fur Company, the Fur Brigade, would go from St. Louis out to the Green River Rendezvous. And so he traveled out with them, met the Flatheads there, and had mass form a Green River Rendezvous. And then he went from there to Jackson, went up to Pierre's Hole, which is another location, and met 1,600 more Flatheads. So what happens at the Green River Rendezvous? This is where all the free trappers and all the natives and the company people all meet. And it looks like kind of a sedate, you know, business-like environment here, doesn't it? Well, here's the other version. What they did, they would drink and gamble and fight and tell stories and race and trade and drink, okay? I mean, it could be a pretty wild time, but that's what he got in for. So as part of that, he gathered up about 2,000 people and went up on a hill right above the Green River Rendezvous and had mass for him. French, Latin, English, you know, native tongues. I mean, it was quite the event. Here's the little monument that's up there. And you can see the Green River Rendezvous right in the background. This is on a hill that's about 200 feet high, and the Green River Rendezvous was right back behind there. So from here, he went to Jackson, went up to Driggs, Idaho, Pierre's Hole, and then he said, you know, I'm going to need help. And he went back up the Beaverhead River, went up to Three Forks, and went back down, went overland, but ended up back in St. Louis. He said, I can't do this myself, I got to have some help. And so went back to St. Louis. Next spring he came out and did the same thing. And same route, went back to Green River Rendezvous. This time he went up and he ended up all the way back up in Missoula at the Bitterroot Valley. But on his way doing that, he stopped at Red Rock Pass. And from Red Rock Pass, he could see Henry's Lake, which drained into the Snake River and the Pacific Ocean. And then he could also look down to the west and see Red Rock Lake, which drained into the Beaverhead River and the Jefferson River, and then the Missouri, and went all the way down to Mississippi. So he could stand up there and see, you know, he's up on the Continental Divide, and you can see both these lakes that drain different directions. And so he made this, made an inscription, St. Ignatius, patron of mountains. But this inscription has never been found, apparently. So I think that's a great field trip for us, okay? Now I can't imagine over time some elk hunter hasn't, you know, found it, but apparently it's never been found. So, and I got a couple other ideas for field trips in here that we'll have to maybe go do. Here's another one. Father Point was with him, and next year he went with the Flatheads to go on the road to the buffalo. They were going to go to eastern Montana, go hunting for buffalo. And so they're up on Lewis and Clark Pass, Continental Divide, in between Missoula and Great Falls. And but that's also, it's Blackfoot country. And so he wanted to announce to the Blackfeet that the Black Robes were here. So he takes all the local rocks. Now this isn't built vertically, he laid it out in the ground. It's about 6 feet by 12 feet. And this is the sketch that came from the Montana Department of Archaeology. And they found that cross is up there on Lewis and Clark Pass. So you can drive up to within, I think, about a mile and a half of it. So that sounds easy, doesn't it? Okay, Dick will send out a sign-up sheet. We'll go up there next year and go see it. But look at the names of so many people. You know, you wouldn't have any idea there's so much French and European influence out here in this early time, okay? Here's where they're from. So, like I say, a lot of these missionaries, they said they're in Europe, and they said, the U.S. Western history has always fascinated Europeans. Europeans love Western U.S. history, and this is an early piece of it right here. So, but not everything was by land, and not everything was fun and games, okay? Now think what lost at sea means. Okay? If you've read about any of these ships going around Cape Horn in March, April, which is their winter, okay? They're the start of their winter. And, here you got, 16 religious and the crew, and the ship's so iced up or they'll hit rocks or whatever. But think about what they would have gone through. What does lost at sea mean? Okay? And this bishop, he was going to handle, his area was Hawaii, Marquesas, Polynesia, Tahiti, Solomon Islands. He had that whole area. 30 people missing. So anyway, back to our newspaper story here. Okay. This is what really jump-started things. And so the Methodists were the first ones to come out here. They went down to French Prairie and the Dalles. And Jason Lee, was their head guy, Reverend Lee. But they were here to convert as many natives as they could, but they just really didn't have a lot of success doing that. And after 7 years, Jason Lee was recalled. Not transferred, recalled. Okay? And they sent somebody else out here for a couple of years to kind of try to patch things back together and see what they got. And they finally just closed everything after 10 years. They just weren't getting anywhere with the natives. Here's, this is a big state park at Keezer, north of Salem. And there's 3 buildings known as ghost buildings. Kind of a nice economical way to show what was there, wouldn't it? Make these buildings out of pipe and everything. In the Dalles, anybody seen Pulpit Rock? Okay, pretty interesting. Right next to the tennis courts of the high school. Okay, so next time you drive to Portland, go up and see it. Here's a mural that's downtown. But Pulpit Rock, see the preacher up there? I mean, that's exactly what's there. Pulpit Rock with Mount Adams in the background. It's exactly what the river looks like from that angle. It's exactly the curve of the river, the mountains, and everything. So kind of neat stop. Like I say, right next to the tennis courts of the high school. So they started a mission at DuPont, south of Tacoma, near Steilacoom. But they didn't have a lot of success with the natives. Fort Nisqually is right at the golf course called the Home Course in DuPont. That's where Fort Nisqually is. Right next to the first green. Okay? You need to go see it. Take your golf clubs, you go see it. So, they came out here to try to put things together. mostly engaged in secular affairs. They went through $50,000. They bought 16 acres, 16 sections of land, 10,000 acres of grain and cattle. Indian natives weren't interested in grain and cattle. They kind of thought they could build it, we build it, and they will come. Didn't happen, okay? So, nothing really happened there. And of course at Fort Vancouver, you know, a lot of the traders were Scottish, they were Episcopalian, they were Anglican. Dr. McLaughlin, his wife was part Swiss and part Cree, I think it was. And so they had a common law marriage, which is real common. La Faucon du Pays, the custom of the country. Okay? Remember we've heard about that, you know, David Thompson and everything, and take a walk, you know, a native wife, and but then when it's time to go back home, you go back home. And so that's what happens there. So he said, I can't do this. This isn't going to work. I'm going to go someplace else. And so let's talk about the Whitmans, okay? Couple of interesting things about this. The two biggest watershed events in history with the Native Americans in the country, in the West anyway, Custer's Little Bighorn and the Whitman Massacre. Now, I know you grow up in the Northwest, you just kind of think, yeah, you know, it's the Whitman Mission, yeah, it's close by. You know, you kind of take it for granted. You don't really understand how big of a watershed event this really was. Huge issue, okay? So here's Narcissa and Marcus. And Narcissa, shortly before her 16th birthday, she dedicates herself, I want to be a missionary. Okay, fine, that's great. She wants to be a missionary. Marcus originally wanted to be a missionary, but he figured, well, I gotta get something that pays a little better, so he was a doctor. And then, remember this letter that was in the Methodist newspaper, okay, or this article? And there's a Reverend Parker who put on a series of meetings, you know, telling about these the natives and the need out here and everything, and trying to do recruiting. Marcus went to one of those meetings and said, by golly, that's what I'm gonna do. And then a few days later, he puts on another one of these meetings, and Narcissa is there. And she says, that's what I want to do. So they both sent letters to the board, the mission board, to this Reverend Parker, said, we want to be missionaries. And Reverend Parker's looking at this, he says, well, you guys need to be married to do this, and Marcus, you need to find yourself a good missionary wife. Okay? And so that's kind of how that came together. They came out west with Henry and Eliza Spalding. Now, Henry is a crank, and we will see that all the way through this, okay? He's the illegitimate son of an illegitimate woman. Not that that's the worst thing in the world, but when he was 16 years old, his foster father beat him and kicked him out of the house. Not a good way to start your career as an adult, okay? He ended up at a Bible college a few years later, and one of his classmates was Narcissa. And he asked her to marry him, and she said no. Okay? So that dynamic is still out there throughout a lot of what we're doing here too. And so Marcus, he's looking for a good missionary wife. He knew the princess, you know, her maiden name was Princess. He knew the Princess family, but he never met Narcissa. So on a Saturday, he comes here and meets Narcissa. Next day, he comes back. And he says, hi, Narcissa. Nice to have met you yesterday for the first time. I had met your sister Jane before. I really, really like your sister Jane, but she doesn't want to be a missionary. Okay? And so since I want to be a missionary and you want to be a missionary, and we need to be married to be missionaries. Oh, by the way, I'm leaving tomorrow to go on a scouting trip to Wyoming for 9 months. But before I leave, I need to ask you a question, which is, will you marry me? And so she says yes. He goes all the way out to Green River Rendezvous. He's a big hero with the fur traders out there because of his medical knowledge. Jim Bridger was there at one point, and he surgically pulled a 3-inch arrowhead out of Jim Bridger's back. Okay, and did a few other things like that for some of the other fur traders and everything, and some of the natives. So he was a very, very popular guy at Green River Rendezvous, and we'll talk about that later too. So he comes back after 9 months. They wait a few more months, and they get married. Now, remember, Narcissa said she wanted to be a missionary because she wanted to be like the number of other lady missionaries that died during their missionary, not been martyred necessarily, just died. And so she wanted to be like them. So when she had her wedding, the bride dressed in black. And she had everybody attending the wedding dressed in black. Okay? Because that's the environment she was getting herself into. And so, so the day after their wedding, they head out west. They leave New York, they go down to Pittsburgh and go, Cincinnati and Louisville and go down to St. Louis and everything. The mission they established down by Walla Walla is called Wailupu. And then the Spaldings went to Lapwai. And pretty interesting. But as they're coming down here, now this is a girl from western New York that hadn't been exposed to a lot of things. She gets to St. Louis and she says, "We're at the edge of the world. The edge of civilization." She hadn't even been to Kansas City yet. And she hadn't seen Wallula yet either. Okay? But she's in St. Louis and she says, "We're at the edge of civilization. You ain't seen nothing yet, sweetie." Okay? So they go to Kansas City. Kansas City, at Westport, Kansas City, what's now downtown Kansas City. That's where all the wagon trains and everything kind of collected and headed out. But remember, this is 1836. The Oregon Trail really didn't get going until about 1841, 1842. So that was 5-6 years before the Oregon Trail. And the way that happened, Narcissa was sending a lot of writing back home, quite a bit, and her letters were getting published. That's what gave a lot of these immigrants information about, yeah, we can go do this. If Narcissa and Eliza can do it, we can do it. And so, and they had really, not a terrible time, but it was a little tough for them. Sometimes trying to find something to eat was a little tough. And that was before the bison started to decline. So that's one idea for our next Christmas dinner. We got some more later, okay? So, coming on the trail, like I say, a long trip, long, hot, slow, dusty trip. She gets to Fort Boise. She finally does her laundry for the 3rd time. So she goes all the way from New York to Fort Laramie, Wyoming before she washes her clothes. Can you imagine that? This is the site of Fort Laramie, where the original part of Fort Laramie, where they would have been. So originally Fort Wayne. So they leave Fort Merritt. They're here for about 10 days or so. They rest a little bit. They leave and they go over South Pass. And this is where she meets the Horribles. Now remember, Marcus, he used his surgical skills the year before. And so they hear the Whitmans are coming. So they're 2 days from Green River. And about 10 natives and 5 white traders come out hooting and hollering to meet them. Okay? And here's Narcissa and Eliza riding side saddle, prim and proper. And here come the locals, okay? Kind of was quite a, we just love John Clymer art, don't we? We should maybe do a talk about John Clymer art, because a lot of great Lewis and Clark art, historians art, Whitman's. John Clymer might be a great topic for us sometime. So they meet the Horribles, but they make it to Green River Rendezvous. Here's the plaque that's there. Narcissa and Eliza, first white women in Wyoming, first white women over the Oregon Trail. And July 6th to the 18th was spent at the Green River Rendezvous. Remember all that hooting and hollering and drinking? You know, wasn't just a lot of real sedate little trading. You know, I got furs and hides, you got blankets, you know, those kinds of things. There's a little bit more to it than that, and that really kind of made an impression on her too. So they left Green River, they went through, they went to Fort Hall, down by Pocatello, and then they went along the Snake River, like all the Oregon Trail people did after them, went over the Blue Mountains, and then from the top of the Blue Mountains, she said she could see Mount Hood. And this is another field trip we need to take. I got to figure out where this spot was where they could see Mount Hood. And she said Mount St. Helens, probably Mount Adams, you know, because Mount St. Helens is another 30, 40 miles from there. But it's probably Mount Adams, but she said she could. And I know you can see Mount Hood from Umatilla, if the light's right. But from up there in the mountains above Pendleton, she said she could see it. So they come over the Blue Mountains, they go down to Umatilla River, they end up in the Walla Walla River drainage, and they end up at what was Fort Nez Perce, now Fort Walla Walla. That was their destination. Originally, the Fort Nez Perce originally built by the Northwest Company as Fort Nez Perce 1818, and then when Northwest Company and Hudson Bay got together, it became Fort Walla Walla. And you know, there's three, you've heard the term Fort Walla Walla a lot. There's 3 fur trade forts named Fort Walla Walla at Wallula. There's 3 military Fort Walla Wallas in Walla Walla, okay? So Fort Walla Walla, you gotta be sure about which one you're talking about. What we're talking about is this one out here. You guys have all been through here. If you drive from Pasco to Walla Walla, this is what you see. This is Wallula Gap, Fort Nez Perce, Fort Walla Walla, right out in the middle out there. And remember, she's in St. Louis. We're at the edge of civilization, okay? This is where Narcissa had to go if she went to the grocery store. Pretty Spartan place even now. So they got to Fort Walla Walla and they kind of regrouped. And they said, okay, where are we going to go? We got to go down to Fort Vancouver. We got to meet Dr. John McLaughlin. We got to get some supplies. We got to hopefully meet this Reverend Parker, who was out here the prior year with Marcus, and see what he has to say. And so they head down to Columbia to go down to Fort Vancouver. And remember, you know, you've been down to behind the Dalles there, Salito Falls, Long Narrows, longest continuously inhabited place in North America because of all the fish. Used to have 16 million salmon coming in the river every year. And the natives would catch a lot of them there at Salito Falls and the Long Narrows. Now what is 350,000 pounds of salmon, or 350,000 salmon every year mean? Fish guts and skins everywhere, right? Which means fleas, okay? So she's down at the Long Narrows, watching the men folk portage the gear. I bet all these fleas crawling up her dress got her attention, wouldn't it? So they went down to Fort Vancouver, and the menfolk, they decided where they were going to build their missions. The menfolk came back up the river to build their missions and everything, and the women folk stayed down at Fort Vancouver, and then they had them come up, and Marcus and Narcissa had built their place at Waialapu. And Marcus had built her a home, which actually the original cabin is still there at the site. You can see the outline of it, right next to that bigger house that they had a little bit later. But when she got there, this is what she saw. No windows or doors, but I got a wood floor. That means she won't have to spend the winter with a dirt floor. She's happy, okay? Now, a week after this, got 18 inches of snow. No windows or doors, but she does not have a dirt floor. So things are doing okay. She's getting by okay. So Henry, let's get back to Henry here a little bit. Henry was writing these letters back to the mission board in Boston, saying how wonderful everything is going on out here and we're doing all these things. So the mission board sent out, unannounced, sent out 3 couples out here of missionaries, 6, or actually 8 people. And so they've got to deal with 8 people, they got to feed them, and you got some real personality problems, because apparently these people are just kind of bickering all the way out here, all the way from where, you know, New York, wherever they came from. And Mary Walker. So remember Mary Walker School District up in Springfield? Okay, that's this lady. We call her the tablecloth lady. I was half tempted to not eat. Can you imagine that? So after this, Mary and Narcissa had a little tete-a-tete. They chatted a little bit and kind of were able to make it so they get along. And Narcissa spent the next week locked in her room, in bed. And she would do that pretty often. She'd have these big stretches where she wasn't in the state of mind she wanted to be in, and she was just ill for weeks at a time, stayed in her room. Okay? So that did happen a fair amount with her. And of course she's very homesick. She's writing all these letters back home, but nobody's writing to her. And she's trying to get her sister and her brother to come out here. She keeps writing to them, you guys need to come out here and see us. Or come out, better yet, come out here and be missionaries with us. Jane, the one that Marcus liked. But that never happened. So at one point, Jason Lee, the Methodist, minister, he came by. He stopped at Whitman Mission. Now the Whitmans, their mission board had given them a budget of $500 per family per year. This guy burned through $50,000. And he says, you guys need to do it the way I do it. And to do it the way I do it, you need 30 missionaries.